welcome everybody to our second session here of our North Korea. This is our become an annual event for our North Korea Economic Forum. It's the fifth time we've done this. And today we have a special guest, Seiler, who probably anybody who's worked on North Korea knows Seiler. He's been around this field for what, 30 years, I think, 40 years. I would say there's no one in the American anyway, Korea better than Seiler in many aspects of it. We go back a long time too. My favorite experience with Sid was about 5 years when we were both in the North Korea mission manager's office. Joe DeTrani was the boss. He was the mission manager, and Sid was the, I guess, deputy mission manager, right? And we had a really great time and a really good team, looking very in-depth at the North Korean nuclear program. Mostly, that was our mission, to find their nuclear weapons. I don't know if we found their weapons, but we did, I think, find their production facilities. So that was a very interesting experience for me. And Sid kept at it. He went to the NSC, working on North Korea, the top person at the NSC for North Korea. And then he went back to Korea for a number of years. He served about 12 years in Korea. I'm always very embarrassed because I've lived in Korea a lot longer than Sid. My Korean speaking is like at a 1 or a 2. That's low. Sid, I remember, came in one day. He said, "I got a 5 on my test." 5 is kind of impossible. 5 is native. Sid's Korean is spectacular. At least, especially his reading is spectacular. So anyway, he goes back a long time. I go back a long time. Our forum is generally economic focused, and we generally do not. We've generally avoided the nuclear issue, partly because all these other think tanks around here, I can see them, focus so much on the nuclear issue. Our niche has been the economic issue. But take advantage of Sid here. We want to let him talk about the nuclear issue. I want to go back, though, to before most of you were born, 1984. I was working at CIA on writing a big paper on North Korean economy. Now, it's so old you could probably FOIA it now and get a. I mean, it's a pretty good paper, North Korean industry, 1984. And a friend of mine over here at, this is fun, we can see everywhere, over here at NPIC, the Office of Imagery Analysis, called me up and said, "Bill, I want you to come in and look something." So I take the shuttle down here to where it's now where the National Stadium is, right there. And he shows me this overhead picture of this plant we had been watching, thinking it was an electric power plant. And they have exposed, and you can look at it, and there's this matrix inside the plant, matrix thing, cells. And I said, that doesn't look like an electric power plant. And he brings out another picture. This is from England. This is the exact same looking thing. Well, what is that? He says, that's where England produces its plutonium for its nuclear program. So this is 1984. Kim Il-sung has, in a way, he said, we don't need electricity. We need nuclear weapons, right? From that point on, in my reckoning, that was about North Korea's peak industrial performance at that point. 84, and it was the top of its sort of what we call command economy system, socialist system. Ever since, all that has gone downhill. Not spectacularly, it's just been inching down. The economy is much worse off now than it was in 1984. The other side of the coin, though, of course, is the nuclear program progressed to today. It has nuclear weapons. So you have these two trends, an upwards nuclear program, a downwards economy, an apparent trade-off between the two. So, Sid, what I'd like to ask you, we all know that a regime wants to protect itself. That's its fundamental, and it's not unusual. A regime like the Kim family. What do you think it would take for them to change their mind? I don't mean Kim Jong-un, but I mean the regime, the whole system, to sort of change those two trajectories.
No, that's a great question. And thank you for the invitation to come out here and speak. There's a lot of issues where the domestic economy of North Korea, the regime's economic goals, and its foreign policy, its orientation toward the outside world, in particular, its pursuit of, its justification of, and its refusal to engage in a discussion of the disablement and dismantlement of their nuclear program. And 1984 is an interesting date. And if my slide can be projected, could you put it up real quickly at this time? It is worth looking back at the history to understand how we got here and what it means about the identity, the ontology, the security needs of the regime, and how it makes the prioritizations that it does. 84 is an interesting time to start because, as you note, it really is the peak of their economy. And I don't know if in the initial pursuit of a nuclear weapons program, Kim Il-sung and Kim Jong-il could have envisioned this, but from 1986 onward, it becomes only more imperative. Why do I choose 1986? Because 1986 is a prelude to 1988. We all know what 1988 was. It was the Summer Olympics. It was, in many ways, the victory march, victory lap of the Republic of Korea, which, with countries like the Soviet Union, China, all the Eastern Bloc countries in attendance, against Pyongyang's strong demands, some of them having come in 1986 for the Asian Games. But it really was the point at which South Korea emerges as the dominant power in all elements of national power. We could, debate how strong the conventional forces were in 88, in 1990, et cetera. We know there's a deterioration of the conventional forces, but for all intents and purposes, South Korea is the winner. And with the subsequent normalization of relations, as we know under Notayu, Nordpolitik, first in was Hungary. I remember their embassy was right down the street from where I was living at the time. And then all the other events, the fall of the Soviet Union, the fall of the wall, the collapse of all the socialist states, particularly Ceausescu in Romania, which is the model. Kim's not afraid of being primarily about Saddam Hussein or Muammar Gaddafi examples. Ceausescu is the concern of the regime from that point onward. Its world is turned upside down, and how that's perceived in the military domain, we begin to see this focused on trying to develop a nuclear capability to compensate for the erosion of the conventional forces. And on the economy, we begin to see these trade-offs. And from that point onward, it is the existential concern of the people rising up against the regime, such as we witnessed in the Eastern European cases, that has been the driver for the North's nuclear program. And understanding all along the way the trade-offs that had to be made as a result.
See, you can turn that another way, though. You can also say the weakness of the economy could be a driver for instability.
That's a very good point. And so, the question that the regime had to ask, and at each of these periods of engagement or periods of breakout, what is the cost and what are the benefits? And when what I've projected on this slide, and I'm sure those out in Zoom land are looking at it, trying to decipher some of these shorthands that I have there. But the green is designed to represent the periods that North Korea engaged in some type of outreach, whether it be the initial high-level talks in the 90 to 91, 92 time period, the agreed framework, Albright, almost Clinton visit of late 2000, around that time, sunshine. What you see with each of these efforts to try to maybe potentially explore what diplomatic interaction with the outside would be, I would argue that each of these outreaches were designed to reach some type of culmination point for short-term concession-seeking goals, not long-term fundamental either improvement of the U.S. DPRK relationship or the inter-Korea relationship, or pursuit of some integration into the international community that would be some distant cousin of Deng Xiaoping's reform and opening approach. In each and every one of those cases, it reaches a point of culmination. They break out, the situation returns to a status quo ante, the economy continues to suffer and deteriorate. Well, in the red, we see these advances of the nuclear missile program. Again, representing the strategic continuity of North Korea's prioritization of its WMD program over the needs of its people.
Yeah. So it's pretty apparent to me anyway that in the early 80s, actually even before then probably, the Kim Il-sung and then his son and his grandson have prioritized this nuclear development. We in the outside, I think we tend to think, well, they're trying to protect their country from us, basically, a defensive measure. Or you can argue, well, they want to threaten South Korea, and what a better way to keep us at distance. But from the economic issue, it's just so intriguing to me that during this whole time of dropping of the North Korean industrial state, I mean, their huge steel mill basically stops. There's a shell now. All this heavy industry has gone down. Their energy sector is in horrible shape. But the market economy has risen. Kind of the market sort of fills in the gaps.
Right.
I don't think it's deliberate on the North Korean side. It's not like we want to reform. No, they've never said that. They've never used this reform word. But they've allowed their socialist system to go down and allow as their nuclear program risen. So it's this trade-off that they've made that's so interesting to me. And I think looking to the future, how would that trade-off change? You know, what is there? Obviously, they want to stay in power. There's no doubt about that.
Right.
What would it take for them to recalibrate the nuclear program? Maybe not get rid of the nukes, but do something that allows their economy to start growing again, more like maybe China.
So that's a great point. I think it may help to look back and to look forward in this case. And by looking back, you know, in particular, understanding that at the root of North Korea's economic problems is the very system itself.
Yes.
And its inability to continue its sustainability in the absence of benefactors it enjoyed during the Cold War.
Mm-hmm.
The favorable trade conditions, other inputs that it received, other support and aid that it received from the Soviet Union and China. Again, that favorable environment that appeared to have existed that can at least explain some of the economic success up to the early 1980s, perhaps not much later than that. So how much of it is that world going in the past? Of course, there were natural disasters that also contributed to it. You know, but every year it's either a flood or a drought. The numbers either jump up a couple $100,000, 1,000 pounds in terms of production of rice and other staples, or they go down. But they've never really come up with a substitute for that support structure that they had during that era. Now it's then you fast forward to 2018 and 2019 and try to understand what transpired in Singapore, Hanoi, and afterward. Right? In Singapore, you saw, and I remember I was in Korea at the time watching KCTV and its coverage of the event and the raised expectations that the long-term diplomatic goal of gaining tolerance or even recognition or confirmation of its nuclear weapons state and exploring the potential for a future in which no longer did North Korea have to worry about its economic and other diplomatic ambitions being restrained by its nuclear status. Singapore appeared to be sending that signal that a road is now open. Donald Trump, President of the United States, is a nuclear weapons power sitting across from Kim Jong-un, the leader of a nuclear weapons state. When the realization came that world was not what was accomplished at Singapore, and it was only driven home even more at in Hanoi when President Trump rejected that vision of Kim Jong-un, which would put a few things on the table to get some major sanctions relief while leaving the rest of its program, a theoretical possible discussion point for the future. But when that disappointment came in, then North Korea pivots to an alternative path. And that is a path that is articulated. You can read it in the readout of the Fifth Party Plenum of the Seventh Party Congress, issued on January 1st, 2010, right? 2020. That laid out the ideological framework and justification for and direction of future North Korean domestic political, economic, foreign policy, et cetera, based upon protracted period of isolation, austerity, belt tightening, non-interaction with the outside world, and overcoming of all these difficulties through self-reliance. Now, let me close with this. An assessment of this is complicated by COVID, because COVID made a necessity out of an ideological framework that the head-on breakthrough offensive language had already laid out. In other words, how different would North Korea be today if it had not been hit by COVID? That speaks to what are the parameters in which trade with the outside, investment in certain areas, tourism, resumption, the economic possibilities in the post-COVID era all have to be tied back to this, what type of world Kim was envisioning for a non-denuclearizing North Korea.
So the COVID, I quite agree. The COVID blockade, or sort of, where they really disallowed imports from China,
right,
really in a way protected the regime. I think it was a protection mechanism more than anything.
And that speaks to the liberalization issue, which you mentioned, or marketization, dollarization, whatever you want to call it. A lot of the liberalization that we had seen taking place in North Korea as a coping mechanism, very smart coping mechanism that developed pockets of wealth that alleviated some of the resource restraints, the access to food and other critical materials. And there was an inherent risk that was being taken by the regime as it tolerated that, a risk that they were willing to accept.
Yeah.
A lot of that was reversed during COVID, in the name of COVID.
Yeah, I would probably not put that in past tense, though. To me, the marketization, monetization, over the same period, North Korea changed from 84 to now.
Right.
It changes dramatically from a ration economy to a money economy.
That's
clearly
fair.
Now money circulates. I think Kim Il-sung would be pulling his hair out. What have we done?
So that's the question. Is Kim Jong-un trying to go back to that previous Kim Il-sung?
He may be, but so that's a great question, and I think it's sort of impossible to do. Once your money's, it's a hard thing to go back. I think they might be trying a little bit, but I don't think it's working.
Because they're going to just bring on the same hardship difficulties that force them to have to tolerate.
Once money circulates, everybody wants money, and it corrupts the regime.
So the diplomatic goal of North Korea over the last 30 years, I would say, what does it use this diplomacy for? Certainly not to advance relations with the United States or to find a path towards reconciliation with South Korea. The diplomacy has primarily been to provide, to ensure the environment is conducive to North Korea's pursuit of weapons of mass destruction, so that the activities it's taken in that pursuit, to include 6 nuclear tests, repeated ICBM launches, et cetera, even though they may bring on sanctions, the sanctions have never been regime threatening because the diplomacy is there to support it. Now the diplomacy is, Kim's vision of the ideal world, my take on this, based upon the rhetoric we see and the actions we see being taken, is that somehow the future may not be so bright you have to wear shades, but at least the future appears more conducive to the type of world Kim envisions, where he can keep his nuclear weapons and not have sanctions or other restrictions impeding his ability to move capital, to access necessary technologies, et cetera. And that in these open challenges to the Western-led, so-called US-led liberal order by Beijing and Moscow may provide that environment. Cold War II, if you want to call it that. but the environment that's more conducive to Kim's goals. And so I think for the economists, because this is as far as I can take it as a generalist, the economist's question today is what would be possible if these trends continue? We have a bloc, we have a Moscow, Beijing, Pyongyang, Tehran, and others who are willing to deal with each other within this bloc, who are willing to ignore sanctions.
But, Russia and China both are basically market economies.
That's right.
So North Korea is really, it's a pariah state. It's really out by itself. What I would say a very risky, dangerous. So if I'm in Pyongyang, I'm scared to death, and I want nuclear weapons to protect me. I think that's kind of the way I look at it. But there's also this interesting factor that I've always wondered if Kim Il-sung or Kim Jong-un now gets really nervous about social unrest, domestic. That to me is the threat to the regime, nothing from outside. Nobody's going to push them over. But inside, the threat is internal. He's always got this card, the nuclear card. He can just speak a few little nice words to our president or to South Korean president and say, hey, maybe we'll start denuclearization. Maybe we'll shut down Yongbyon. I guess that's what he's said a little bit at Hanoi. What's that worth to them? Wow. I mean, you can imagine if we're giving $60 billion this year to Ukraine, how much would we pay North Korea upfront dollars to make some adjustments to its, it could be $100 billion, which could be transformative for North Korea.
I don't know that the discussion ever made it to that point, but if you go back to the agreed framework period where the model basically was you come clean on past plutonium activity, you keep those fuel rods shut, you shut down the reactor, we'll give you a light water reactor, you return to the NPT, we normalize relations. So all the good things come at the end of a process of denuclearization, which, given if you just consider the timelines along which cooperation with AQ-CON begins, and the HEU program, in the mid 1990s starts to make forward progress. By the middle of the agreed framework period, North Korea has already made the decision to break out and pursue nuclear weapons. And then in subsequent negotiations, six-party talks, this future for North Korea, the possibilities, started with at that time 6 to 10 billion. The numbers keep going up, but the benefits that would come to North Korea of reconciliation with Japan, normalization of relations with Japan, the economic benefits that would begin to flow in from the Republic of Korea. The U.S. has never been so blatant to say we'll give you X $billion for. But we've gotten close, particularly on the missile part piece.
I think we were going to give them $1 billion for the missiles.
Exactly, but as time went on, and this is what's again the beauty of our approach over the years is that we have had forward-leaning thinkers, and that's from the agreed framework to the six-party talks, to lead the understanding, to the Singapore Hanoi summit. In each case, we gave North Korea an opportunity. We put before them, that's not dollar figures, but alternative, project economic.
So what I'm thinking is it's kind of a card that they hold. They think they hold. But if things get really bad, suggesting things they're not that worried. But if things get really bad internally, they think, we can sell our weapons.
I think that could be part of it. Part of it too is that, again, going back to the point, I think B.R. Myers made a very astute observation one time in noting the period alone that this has taken for the nuclear program to get where it is today is proof that they're not developing these weapons in the face of an existential challenge that must be immediately addressed. They know the U.S. and the Republic of Korea are committed to peace, 70 years of armistice. What they're afraid about is that internal instability scenario and how to prevent outside influence, outside intervention in a period of internal collapse. And so they're, rather than selling off the weapons for money in that type of scenario you present, escalating tensions on the peninsula to the point where we are begging them to stand down,
Mhm.
and we are paying them to come back to the table. You know, in our national intelligence estimate that we had declassified earlier in the year from the Office of Director of National Intelligence, this is exactly what that coercive and that revisionist scenario implied, that there would be a way that through the use of force, up to and potentially even including use of nuclear weapons, that they could compel an outcome diplomatically, militarily, and economically beneficial to the North through the use of such intimidation and blackmail, is exactly what we need to be worried about right now.
Yeah, that's certainly the worry, but I'm just offering the suggestion that it may work the other way around. You know, if people are hungry in the streets.
Well, you
would
know,
they-
if North Korea came with a dollar figure, like if you give us $1 billion,
No,
we'll
no,
come
I
back.
mean, like.
You sell a device to a third
No,
country.
I mean 100 billion. I think
Well,
that-
even if they said, well, you give us $100 billion, Bill, what you're talking about is an opening bid in a process.
Yes, right.
And it'll be the first time since, frankly, Hanoi, that they used the D word, denuclearization.
Yeah.
So during the period of
Yeah.
Singapore, it's interesting looking back. Nobody seriously who had been following this issue thought that Kim Jong-un committed to Singapore, committed to denuclearization, either to Chung-un, National Security Office Director Chung, or to President Trump in Singapore. But it was nevertheless the first time that they used the denuclearization word in a way credible enough to justify the engagement that subsequently took place.
Yeah.
Right now, we're in a position now where, for some reason, Kim Jong-un, it's a matter of principle. We said we're a nuclear power. It's not up for discussion. This is where the flaw in those who would say, listen, Sid, you know, you guys have been so focused on CVID, perfect, you've missed the good, which would be arms control. And that's just absolutely not the case.
Okay, let's talk about some other issues, because Sid is so knowledgeable about North Korea generally. Really, really, you are following it for 30 years. I wanted to ask about the regime itself. Just a couple of questions, quick. Maybe I'll just go through my questions if I can find them.
Easy ones.
Let's talk about the Kim family.
Okay.
You know, I think most of us were shocked, but not surprised. Can you be shocked and not surprised? I don't know. Shocked when Kim Jong Nam was assassinated in Malaysia. Right. Here's the son-in-law of Kim Il Sung. You know.
Right.
Wow. Now it's pretty clear that the Kim Jong Un ordered the assassination, or at least allowed it to happen. And then there's now we see Kim Jong Un up there with his wife and his daughter, trying to create a nice family kind of scene, and maybe they are a nice family. I don't know. It could be, but then you have this shocking sort of killing of the relatives, several relatives. How does that square? How do you, is this like a medieval king, where you kill off the potential usurpers, or is it Korean history is full of replete with that, but so is European. It's sort of a normal king kind of a thing in a way. You build up the family, and the family then is the transition, keeps the thing alive. Is that the way you look at it, or is it sort of, how do you look at it?
Because we also have to take into consideration the execution of Chung Sung.
I mean, Chung Sung Tek,
Right,
yes.
right. So you have this semi-covert, of course, the whole world knows about it. I don't know how many North Koreans know about, what happened in Kuala Lumpur with the assassination of Kim Jong Nam. But then you have this openly declared, execution. Everybody knew who Chung Sung Tek was in North Korea. It's just a reminder of the monolithic system. It is a, one man, potentially one day a one woman rule. I do think that comes into play. But, for now, the legitimate bloodline goes through Kim Jong-un, and no competitors are tolerated. Kim Jong-chol probably goes through a daily life of relative obscurity and quietness, and convinces Kim Jong-un enough that he's not any type of threat. So anybody who would be seen as a threat to North Korea, and remember, this is not about a power threat. This is not a faction that would challenge Kim Jong-un, although you might argue that Chung Sung Tek had such networks and could have potentially been such.
Enough of a threat that they had to kill him. Yeah.
I didn't think Chang Sung-taek ever really had that in mind, but the fact that if anybody in the North Korea thought that Chang Sung-taek was so competent and crucial to performance in the economic sector, he had to go.
Yeah.
And this is the challenge in North Korea. You never want to be number two.
So this is sort of my second question in that regard. You know, running a socialist country, a state like this, is mind-boggling difficult. You know, the regime has to make so many decisions, much more than in a market economy where millions of people make millions of decisions. There's this top-down, and a top-down system like that requires lots of tough decisions, trade-offs every day. So let's step down from Kim Jong-un and look at what you might call a cabinet or the next echelon of leaders. How do they play in North Korea? Are they just tokens to Kim Jong-un, or do they have independent kind of like Ministry of Metallurgy? Does he run the metallurgy thing by himself, kind of? How does that work?
You know, I wouldn't think about North Korea too differently than you would any system where you have this similar challenge of, you know, degree of institutionalization, where are the inputs coming in, how are the outputs being enforced, policy outputs, you know. You do have a unique situation in North Korea where, you know, with the party control, and what that really means is that there is a certain framework and boundaries within which all activity is tolerated or allowed in North Korea, and understanding those parameters is important. Just off the top of my head, I remember the Wheels Up party. So, you know, after Madeleine Albright and her delegation from Washington had gotten in her plane and left Pyongyang, there was a gathering with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and of course Ministry of State Security, no doubt, was there, and the rest of the delegation. And I sat next to a gentleman. We started to talk about the media for some reason, and I said, so wait, how does your media work? He goes, yeah, it can be frustrating at times. He goes, you know, because, you know, we'll see something in Nodong Shinmun about our area of work that we hadn't gotten notified of yet, and we were struggling to figure out what it means and how to catch up. And usually the directives will come down a little bit later, but you know, sometimes the media will get ahead. So you can imagine a party process by which a decision on you know, whether it's a foreign policy direction that's to be pursued, or an economic area of emphasis that's to be enforced, or something in the financial system, that, you know, the party has made a decision about, you know, what is tolerable, what is not, what is desired. And then that is then received and executed within the cabinet structure. And then feedback comes, and, you know, it's Kim inherited a very dysfunctional organization. There was a major breakdown of the party and the bureaucracies when Kim took power. He's been trying to rebuild those in an absence of resources. I mean, how would you like to be the minister of bridge building? And here's the deal: you got no concrete, you got no steel. I can give you 10 men to work the issue, build a bridge by next January.
It reminds me of Pak Bong-ju. You remember Premier Prime? So they called him the premier of Pukchang Power Plant. Basically, his job, he's the premier of the country, but his main job was making sure the big power plant gets the coal shipment every day. You know, 100 train car of coal, 100 cars of coal every day has to go, and he's in charge of that. Here's the premier of the country worried about a power plant. That's, to me, represents the next echelon of North Korea, where the decisions are just very tough day to day. They can't think very far ahead. Another question, though, it came up yesterday. I kind of like the discussion on populism. Remember, we had that. You were listening, and I love the idea that Dr. Kim, the discussant, made that. Well, you know, if there's populism, the populism has to be against something. What's it against? And he said, elites. So if you think of populism, the opposite side of populism is elitism. And we always talk about the elites in North Korea as sort of the turning mechanism. If there is going to be a change, the elites are the ones that are going to force it. But then you get this populist idea that, the whole country or the normal workers or the peasants or the farmers are going to cause. How do you look at the elites? Do you look at them as sort of, do the elites change from generation to generation, or how do you look at the elites?
So I arrived in South Korea in April of 1982, and I know you were there in the 70s.
I was there in the 52.
52, but were you were young?
You're supposed to say I'm not old enough.
But and in the countryside.
Yes, right.
And what was that song in 1982? There was this Udiye Soul.
Okay.
It was every recording artist, it may have been a Cho Young Pil song, maybe not. But every album had to have a patriotic song on it.
Yeah,
at the time, and this was about how beautiful Seoul was. And I remember.
Well, I was from Gwangju. We didn't think Seoul was beautiful at all.
Yeah, well, that's the Gwangju is another whole story, right? But I was down in Pyeongtaek, and I remember my wife was around there, and at the time, as you recall, there was a pride in the capital that was emphasized, and there was a real sense that we're living out here in the countryside, but if you work real hard and study hard, you can go get a job at a college and move up to Seoul, which represented all the great things about advancing, developing, maturing Republic of Korea. And there's a similarity to how Pyongyang is portrayed.
Yes.
In North Korean propaganda. And Pyongyang really, in a certain way, is the elite. Is one level of elite. It's not the elite. It's not like the top 1%, but it is nevertheless a group of people who are privileged enough to be able to reside there. And I think the challenge for, as you look at North Korean media propaganda and how it plays up, how Pyongyang has been made beautiful by Kim Jong-un, the parks, dolphinarium, the amusement park, apartments, there is a certain pride and that is carefully fostered, so that if you're up in North Hamgyeongbuk, Hamgyeongbukdo, I know it's redundant,
right.
and you're sitting there, you don't have a dolphinarium up there. You're lucky you're not chewing your shoelaces for the nutritional value. That you can cultivate that pride in the advancement of some, even while many others fail to achieve that. There's always been this anti-bureaucratic theme in North Korean propaganda, or this effort by which to blame failures on the economic side or in other sectors on bureaucrats.
So they're very good. Yeah, they are very critical of their own managers.
That to me is a bit more interesting than a populism that would be, fostered by Kim trying to be the people's man, challenging a 1% elite. Certainly, what we don't have is a rich elite in North Korea that is somehow running the country behind the scenes, or that is a potential power challenge to Kim, and Kim is struggling to build a consensus to counter it. I'm certain we don't have that.
Did you, there's this letter that Kim Jong-un wrote to his functionaries, his finance functionaries back in 2015, that Rachel Lee translated for us. Really insightful, incredibly capitalistic sounding letter, if you've read it. It's all about banks. Well, why don't people put their money in the banks? Well, it's because the banks, this is Kim Jong-un supposedly speaking, because you banks don't give the money back. Of course they don't put it in. You got to give them some interest. Oh, the whole speech sounds to me very capitalistic. And it was published in Norong Shinmun 2 years later. But then it's hard to know. It doesn't seem like it's had much traction. But it looked like a pretty substantial reform of the financial sector. The problem for them is that would create these pockets of wealth, like you're talking about, that would have real power. If you have $100 million in North Korea, you have real power. How do you think of this I was sort of thinking that Kim Jong-un may have some capitalistic thoughts. Not that he's capitalistic, but he wants to reform the finance, which is basically moving it toward
I am
Capitalism.
certain there are areas where, first of all, if you read Kyungjae or Nodong Shinmun over the years, what you can see is, I had on my desk I think it was maybe Kim Il Sung University journal, short article on the history of the Reformation. And as
Yeah,
a seminary graduate, I was
Yeah, right.
particularly interested, Presbyterian
right. Yeah.
seminary graduate, I was particularly interested in how it portrayed the Reformation. And after the required, bash of religion at the front and a closing bash at religion in the middle, everything in between, at the end, everything in between was a pretty good basic summary of, Luther, Calvin, etc., showing that, you can have some degree of academic freedom in understanding and knowing about the outside world. Now, whether that translates into, and I'm sure on a second level, that there are a number of things North Korea considers doing or doesn't do, and that they assess the potential political blowback. For me, putting capitalist-like mechanisms into a better functioning financial system is a good way of getting money from under mattresses into accounts where they can be tracked and seized as necessary. And so it's a great anti-corruption or power base tool.
So we only have like a minute left. So I have one final question for you. It's probably unfair. Can you think of anything that we should do on the U.S. side or South Koreans that could sort of promote this movement toward financial liberalization?
That's a good question. Often when you think about these issues, whether it's, getting information into North Korea, and information gets in.
Yeah.
And, you think about what you could do to do more, and whether doing more generates some type of opposite response.
I'm thinking of sort of aiming at this elite, or not necessarily the top. Are there other people to talk to?
I think these elite or to talk to, that's probably beyond the scope of what we could do. A lot of these options, you look at the history again of inter-Korea relations in particular, that menu of things we could do together has been a long-standing menu that North Korea has rejected, but we should never give up trying. That would be my thought.
Okay. Well, thanks a lot. It was very, very informative, and we'll look forward. You're not retiring from North Korea.
Not yet.
You're retiring from the U.S. government, but not. Yeah, he's going to be working at CSIS, I think.
Right.
So we'll be looking for you to keep up your good work.